Welcome to the OTech Talks podcast, where it's all about working on technologies. You will hear the latest tech information, and your host, Kashif Manzoor, brings together product overviews, how-tos, best practices, tips and tricks, and troubleshooting techniques.
Welcome to OpenTechTalks.tv, and today we have a special guest with us, Mr. Lee Schneider. He's the founder of FutureX, and important thing is he just wrote a novel, Surrender. And now you can imagine from the name what surrender mean. Let's understand from Lee, and we learn from him as he's an expert in his field, or having a podcast from long time, and then he is putting together a lot of complex topics in a format that can be easily understandable by like me and like a number of other audiences. So let's welcome Lee on our show, and I will just pass to Lee to introduce himself to the audiences of Open Tech Talks, and then we will have a wonderful chat.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about synthesizing large, messy, complex bodies of knowledge and to create little delivery packages for that knowledge, which are articles and novels and sometimes podcasts. And I started my career in media by working for Dateline NBC and NBC News and news people. And basically it meant writing down what the ideas for a story on a notepad, and then maybe writing that up and putting it up on a teleprompter so the host could read it. And that's about as complicated as things got. But when I started writing novels and long form things, Surrender is a novel about the climate crisis, and it bridges what's known as hard science fiction, which is totally fact-based, and fantasy, things that I've made up. But I wanted to start, if I'm writing about the climate crisis, I wanted to have some credibility. So I wanted to learn about rising water levels and air pollution and the way electricity is made and the way cities are built. And I rapidly began to accrue this massive corpus of information that I had no idea how to connect, because it's one thing to read a lot,
right?
Maybe you make notes in the margins, and it's another thing to remember where all of those things, where you put all that stuff and where all those things are. So I started to evolve an indexing system, which at first was all handwritten, where I would, when I read a book, I would, every book has, I don't know if you can see this, but every book in the front, has a blank page. So I would start to make my own index of the book, which I could later go back to. And that was useful for a while until I had too many books. Right. And then I started to type up those indexes into little mini databases that I put in. You may be familiar with Bear. It's a note-taking app, or the Apple Notes app, or there's one called Craft. There's many Drafts. There's many of these very simple markdown tools. And the beauty of them is that they're searchable. So if you start to index things, if I wanted to write about rising water levels in cities, after a point, say I'd read 5 books on that or 6 articles, and I'd written down my notes, I could go to that index and put in rising water levels New Delhi, rising water levels Alabama, rising water levels New Orleans, and it would bring up my indexes, and then I could go to the books, and I could open up the books and read what I had written, and I could start to glue together this knowledge graph. And it worked for a while until I had even more books. So I started looking at software solutions. There's something called Obsidian, which is a rather experimental, but still pretty good, that
Okay.
makes a map, literally makes a mind map of your materials,
Okay.
where you can literally kind of make a spidery graph of the connected things and see visually where things hooked up.
Mhm.
And that worked for a while, but it also became very complex. Mind maps are wonderful if you have a really big screen. And if
Yeah.
you start really mind mapping, you have something that's almost like a landscape more than a map. I mean, you could zoom in, you could zoom out, but kind of complicated. So right now, the solution I found is called Readwise, readwise.io. And
Okay.
they had a kind of a breakthrough in that for a while, all Readwise did is you could, if you highlighted something in a Kindle book or a Kobo book, it could
Mhm.
go in via the API, grab
Oh,
those
okay.
notes and pull them out, and then you could read them in the
Right.
Readwise app. But
Mhm.
then they added a way to export those notes
Mhm.
and I started to put them into my databases. I started to put them into my little writing apps. And they've since added the ability to, you can take your phone, if there's a passage you like, you can take your
Right.
phone, take a picture of it, and
Okay.
it'll render the text. And then
Okay.
you can put that text in. So you get the theme here is I'm just kind of throwing everything into a big, kind of a big messy box, but it's searchable and it could be tagged. There's ways to organize it. But initially, it's kind of interesting not to organize it, except by the biggest buckets possible. Because the fewer walls you have between your information, the more likely you are to see the relationships between things. And once I started doing this, just putting everything into this big bucket, whatever I read on a Kindle, whatever I scanned in a book, and
Mhm.
now Readwise will do, it'll pull things from the web and you can highlight them and put those highlights in. I found that I start to remember things and find things that I'd read years ago or a year ago, but they relate or they connect. Because if you search one thing like rising water levels, it'll bring up, in my case, 3 or 5 years of reading. Uh,
Right.
maybe in just a list, but a list is not
Right.
bad.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
maybe if I wanted to show it as a mind map, I could show it as a mind map. But I started to realize that to see the interrelationship between all these things became very useful when, say, you're writing an article or writing a book, because you want to have all of that up in front of you in kind of an outline form. But I can even, I don't know if my iPad will show on the screen, but give me
And,
1 second.
and this is all basically your feeding system for the writing.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Like this, I don't know if this iPad will show, but this is an outline, a briefing for this podcast. And what
Mhm.
it is I took my notes from books called Stop Saving the Planet. It's a book about climate anxiety. One Green
Okay.
Thing, a book
Mhm.
about what to do about climate, and a field guide to climate anxiety. And these are all notes pulled, highlights pulled from those books, either scanned in, typed
Right.
in, or, you know, all glued together. And I find that taking this big, messy bunch of ideas, but leaving it, the key for me is leaving it a little bit messy. Because if I started to section it off into different drives or
Mhm.
different folders, if I typed in climate anxiety as a search term, it may not surface everything that I need.
Right.
But if I have it in one big mess, if you will, and I put in that search term, all of that will come up. And then I can create briefing documents or one pagers or whatever I need to write something. Uh, the last part of this, what do you do with all this, is I've been using something called Devon Think,
Okay.
which is another knowledge organizing, runs all in Markdown, and runs on Mac and runs everywhere. It'll run on a portable, on a handheld device, and it's just a massively searchable database of everything that I've talked about, all the books, the articles, notes, random notes that I just talk into the phone, voice memos, whatever I think of. I don't worry too much about, if I tag it, I'll be able to find it, but I don't worry too much about filing
Right.
as much as
Right.
collecting. And then I can find things later with a pretty quick search of a search term.
Great.
Does that make sense?
It is. It is. So now this brought me to a question. As you're writing from long time and you're collecting all the things, so it's mean if there's a new topic for you now, for audiences, how you build credibility. This is what you touched in your while you are applying it. That you're gonna talk, write, or maybe talk about a topic which is not your expertise. So how credibility need to be established? Or maybe the question why I'm leading it, maybe someone is listening from the team or the audience is that, okay, they are new to the technology topic, or maybe they are new to any software package, and they are just starting their journey. So how they can also start some system that way they can start showing the credibility eventually that help them in their career.
Yeah,
So,
that's a good question. I would answer it like this. When I was a producer for ABC, NBC, Dateline, and a writer for Good Morning America, I was an expert in nothing really, except writing news stories. Like if we did a story about tax law, or if for Dateline, we did a lot of stories about murders. I was not an expert in that case before I began working on
right,
that. I'd never heard of the
right.
case before. It was new, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens a lot in journalism is there's this phenomenon of first facts, the
Right.
first things that you learn, which are often wrong. But it's the first thing that you find. An example today would be Wikipedia. You
Right.
might be curious about something and you might look it up on Wikipedia, and
Mhm.
Wikipedia might be right or it might be
Right.
wrong. You don't know,
Right. Yeah,
So
true.
you have to verify it with multiple sources. And what would happen often is if I knew nothing about a case or tax law or you name it, I would look something up sometimes on the internet, sometimes by just
Right.
asking someone, and they would say the answer is B. Yeah, answer
Right.
is A. But then I would ask someone else or go again to another source and ask someone else. And eventually things would start to overlap. And you'd
Mhm.
start to realize, well, everyone has this a little bit differently, but Microsoft Word is used like this. Or
Right.
if you want a podcast, Zoom is a pretty good platform for a
Mhm.
podcast. And you
Mhm.
start to aggregate this, again, this kind of body of knowledge, and you see where the overlaps are. And I found that that is a good way to gain credibility because you're not dependent on one thing. The
Mhm.
mistake, and I've made this in doing interviews where I would be interviewing a doctor and I'd say, well, this is the medical process here. And the doctor would say, no, it isn't. And this is during the interview. And I'd say, well, sorry, what do you mean? He said, where'd you get that information? I said, well, I looked it up on Wikipedia. He said, well, that's wrong. You
Right.
know,
Right.
and
Right.
it was a good lesson. It was embarrassing, but it was a good lesson to learn. I shouldn't have just trusted that single source. If
Mhm.
you read one thing about someone, there's one study about rising sea levels, and I take that study as the basis of
Right.
writing part of my book, which I did. And then 6 months later, I found some other studies that said, no, that study is no longer believed to be
Mm.
true. That's not a good prediction. It's really this. Well, it means that you have to allow a little time and you have to allow multiple sources. It's really about multiple sources because you
All
can't
right.
trust one thing. As good as something is, things become outmoded or new research comes to light or people learn something different. And
Great.
you don't know, if you're just doing an internet search, good luck. I mean, it could be great and it could be terrible.
Agreed. So wonderful. So you gave us the system, how you are doing it. Now you gave us the how to collect the information. Now maybe being you are the writer and hosting podcast. So how you're putting together in a storytelling, because this is what if you are a CIO or CEO or even a manager or even a consultant, you need to present some business idea. It could be a new software, it could be a new startup. So how even the business leaders also need a storytelling, or even if you're working in a sales organization. So what were your ingredients that you were putting together for either you were writing as a journalist or maybe writing for the stories? So what are your main ingredients if you want to share with some?
Sure. I mean, an example and a story, when we say storytelling, a lot of times we mean an example or a scene. And let me break that out. As part of I'm producing a podcast for a company, and as part of the work behind the scenes, I read a lot of business books, a lot of books, about innovation and things like that. And one thing that all those books do is they may have the most brilliant concept in the world, like move fast and break things or think in first principles, but it never quite lands with me until they give an example, a storytelling example that's usually a scene. Like they'll say, here's an example. They'll say, people need to feel safe at work so they can make mistakes and report mistakes, and we can learn from mistakes. Now that sounds good, but until you hear the example, and the writer will say, here's an example. Amy Edmondson, who's a famous psychologist, I think she's at Harvard still, she did a study of nurses at a nursing station at a hospital. And she found that if the nurses felt that their superiors trusted them, they could report medical mistakes. No one get fired or anything like that. They could report medical mistakes and the mistakes could be corrected and everyone could learn from those mistakes. And those were the better hospitals and the better, floors on the hospital. Now, when you told me that story, of course, I go, oh, now I understand. So really, the hardest thing is, say, even in writing a novel, to build this out to that level, if you have an idea about, I want to write about a city that the water levels are rising, and how are people going to get around in that city when there's no more beaches and the land is receding. Okay, I could give you a list of statistics, and they're there, predictive things that say in New York City by 2050 there will be parts of Queens that will be underwater. There'll be parts of Thailand, there'll be parts of the Philippines, there'll be parts of India that will be underwater. And I can tell you by how much, 5 feet, 10 feet. Okay, but what people will remember is if I have a story, and you'll see this a lot in longer form newspaper articles. We start with, there's this family in the Philippines, and they've had to move their house because the water is getting higher. So we kind of come at it from an individual storytelling perspective of an example, or what I would call a scene. Paint a scene. If you look, try with words, paint a picture with words. If you will look at almost any longer form magazine article or better keynote presentation that you can think of, or anything where they have a concept, a TED Talk, the best of them will always have a scene or a story or a personal example that you can grab onto, because there's some crazy statistic. Here I am with a statistic, but there's some crazy statistic that we remember 40% more if it's built in a story than if it's just a bunch of numbers.
I think that you very well explained the building a scene. and then introducing the character. And then I'm a full-time working as an employee, so my job is also, to find out stories. And in a corporate world, when you work in a sales organization, even you need to tell the stories to one customer that, okay, what technology can brings, or maybe X customer is doing this way, and
Right.
then he can relate to it, right? So, and that's a
Right.
hard part. That's a hard part,
It is
which
a
we,
hard
I'm
part.
also hard part.
Yeah, like customer stories are a great example, and I I would often learn when asking questions of people,
Mhm.
whether it's a formal interview or even just um, asking customer questions, you get smarter the more questions you ask. I
Right.
always used to believe, like, the very first interview I do on a topic, I'm not that smart. I'm kind of feeling my way through it. But after I've done 2 or 3 or 4 interviews, I kind of know what to ask, and I know the
Mhm.
best questions. And I don't need notes anymore. I can
Right.
just
Right.
ask. I can just talk. And those interviews become really powerful. You probably know that from podcasts too. Once maybe the first one you ever did of these was, new, but now you know the questions to ask because you've
I
done a few.
Anyway, I noted down some questions, and if you remember, if you know Tim Ferriss, right? I think,
Hmm.
and then he wrote a one book, and I think there was some questions which he used to ask it, and I took a notes of those questions, and I think I'm hardly asking those questions, frankly, over the time. Maybe I've tried in one or two, and I mean, it's you're right. I'm a student. I'm learning from like you folks, but you're absolutely right. Who has
Yeah.
experience on over the time, then they're tuned to the interviews and then asking right questions. So now maybe I will ask the book about surrender.
Hmm.
So, if you can give us some context to it, that surrender mean what for me, for audience, or what is they're gonna get out of the book, or
Right.
maybe why the name comes in your mind, that surrender.
Well, yeah, it's a bit of an ironic name because personally I hate to surrender. I hate to give up. So I said,
Yes.
well, all right, let's challenge myself. Let's
Mm-hmm.
make that the very title of the book that I have to work so hard on. And the whole context of the book is around there's a woman whose husband dies, and she hires a scientist, kind of a startup guy, to create AI avatar of her husband
Mm-hmm.
that essentially has the husband's consciousness and can, like a chatbot, but
Right.
picture a chatbot in 2050, a few years from now,
Got
where
it.
will we
Got
be
it.
with that? And it leads to this idea of a kind of a techno class of tech bros, if you will, or just tech people who think that they can control the growing climate crisis by AI governance, that there could
Mm-hmm.
be something close to general artificial intelligence that's
Okay.
running the world and
Mm-hmm.
running in this, America and the rest of the world. And the government that we has collapsed. It's no longer necessary, according to the tech people.
Novel. Mm-hmm.
And there's an underground movement of people who want to stop that kind of tech takeover. They
Okay.
don't know quite how to do it, but they
Mm-hmm.
know that they're being over surveilled, they're
Mm-hmm.
being overly watched and overly
Mm-hmm.
controlled by a technological class
Okay.
that they
Okay.
don't want to control them anymore. So
Mm-hmm.
the first book takes this woman's journey. Her name is Cat Keeper. It takes her journey from losing her husband to becoming very attached to this
Mm-hmm.
AI version of him, to
Mm-hmm.
realizing that AI has become a bit too much in the world, to trying to start a movement to stop the AI, or at least to use it more wisely and not let
Right.
it control her world in the context of the climate crisis,
Right.
because
Yeah.
this is the world that exists in 2050. I tried to think about a world that is not too strange, but just strange enough. Just a little bit different than what we have now, but with people trying to adapt to hotter temperatures, flooding, bad air pollution, rationing of power and electricity, no more cars allowed in cities, things that probably will happen by 2050 in varying degrees in varying places. So that's the first book, which was published in the spring, and I'm working on the second book because now you have to have more than one. You can't just write one book. So I'm working on the second one, which carries the story forward another 3 or 4 years.
All right. So how was that the response on the first book?
It's really been great. There's been some great reviews, and people have found it. Which is
that's good.
I'm not doing heavy promotion. I'm doing podcasting. I hired a publicist to help me get some reviews and get some listings, and it's selling steadily. I don't, as a new novelist, even though I've been doing media for a while, I'm considering myself pretty new at this. I don't expect to like blow the doors off with the first book, but it's kind of building a longer form thing, to start with the first book, add a second book, maybe a third book, and try to keep going.
All right. If someone want to get the book, is it on Amazon or is it on where? Okay.
Yes. If you go to futurex.studio, you'll see all the links, but it's Surrender by Lee Schneider. It's on Amazon, it's on Kobo, it's in Barnes and Noble, all of those kind of places. Yeah.
All right. Great. So maybe as a concluding to our talks for today, and which we start from collecting knowledge, putting it together, taking notes, and then packaging it and putting it as a storytelling for whatever you're doing in business. So how you see yourself as you are right now hosting a podcast, writing books, and your vast background in journalism. So what future lies for you? So is it more focus on books or more focus on which area? What are you targeting?
I'm aiming at books.
Okay.
I think I have about 3 or 4 more novels in me, which I'm starting to plan out. And I'm still very interested in audio storytelling and podcasting. So I've written a few fiction podcasts that are just, stories, some with actors, some with actors and synthetic AI voices, like bots. The actors talk to a bot. And I'd like to do more of that and find these ways of being immersive in that audio space, because it's almost like a movie that is in your head, a movie that you can hear. So I'm intrigued by that. It's very labor intensive. Novels are labor intensive, but you can do it by yourself. And at the very end, hire some editors. But podcasts, when you're hiring actors, you need actors. So it requires a bit more of a budget and a bit more planning.
Right. I know that's amazing work, frankly, on the building fiction and then bringing the actors to talk and on audio. That's interesting to see. And maybe a last question. As a new generation joining different types of jobs and with the flourish of AI and all that, if someone are new in a journey of career or maybe just graduating from university, and for him, maybe he's not very used to writing or collecting the knowledge, reading habits, maybe he's not having. So what could be the piece of advice for these type of folks, that how they can learn from you, and what should be their actions or steps, small steps they can take?
This is a very interesting question, because if we look at AI, Well, I teach for USC. I teach a media course, and some of my students, English is not their first language,
Right.
and they needed to do a narration for a video, and some of them did a text to speech AI. They were good at writing a script, so they wrote a script and they had the AI read it in a,
Mm-hmm.
and it was good. I think it was a smart idea because they
Right.
felt a little shy about their English. And I think that's smart. And another example I can give is in the app that I was mentioning, readwise.io, they've built a summarization module that uses ChatGPT.
Oh,
And
okay.
you can look at an article and click a little button, a ghost button. It's called Ghost
Right.
Reader. And in a
Okay.
moment, it will summarize the whole article for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be good if you're collecting information, because then you've got a summary that you could
Right.
paste and use. So saving time and maybe not feeling so shy. But what that leaves out, and here's where I'm coming to the piece of advice, is, it's probably would be hard to narrate a video, but it's a growth process to do
Mm-hmm.
it. You'd learn
Right.
something about
Right.
yourself. And all of my reading and wandering in books and finding things and articles and reading another article, it's all a growth process. That
Right.
if I were to go to a chatbot and say, summarize all the research of the past 10 years on global warming
Mm-hmm.
and deliver it in the form of a blog,
Right.
it would do it. But what is my growth process? Zero. I haven't
True.
challenged myself. I haven't tried anything. And when you, especially with writing and media making and podcasting and movie making, you have to try. That's how you get better.
True.
You have to try and sometimes even fail to have a
Right.
growth process happen. So I would say, although it looks tempting, and certainly try it, keep the growth process in there, because that's how you become better at it.
Great. I think that's a great piece of advice, and I agree to the question, to your support. And I agree. And I was just doing my MSc in AI, and I just submitted my dissertation. And while doing research, one of my challenge was also to read a lot of research papers and summarize it. And that you just gave an example of Readwise, and I think that a lot of help to students. That okay, sometimes you don't need to go to the 50 pages or 30 pages of research papers, but you need a summary, and then you want to go, okay, if it fits, then you will go in like a second level of reading or a third level of reading.
Right.
Really appreciate for sharing your knowledge, expertise with the Open Tech Talks, the TV community. And lovely to have you as a guest with us.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to be here, and thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the OTech Talks podcast, and be part of Tech Talks at otechtalks.tv. It's a turf to share ideas, insights, and innovations.